I completed my discussion on the alphabet last time, and a couple of the discoveries, specifically the discovery that was made on Mount Ebal, I think is the one that we had talked the most about. I have been watching my team. They are in Israel right now digging at Shiloh, and I haven't been there since 2019, so I kind of miss the updates and the whole team working. And some of the important discoveries they're making. They think, just as an update, they may have discovered the actual temple, or what would have been the tabernacle structure at Shiloh that was there for 369 years. So we continue to make discoveries. And so what I wanted to do is move on from the alphabet to related topics. And there were some things that I had, some pictures I have here that I want to go over, because you never know what you're going to find in archaeological digs, and specifically with the new technology that we have to discover writing and whatnot, because everything that you find when you're doing archaeological work, everything that you find has to go through several layers of scrutiny. Usually by the initial person digging it and pulling it out of the ground, to doing what we do is light spectrography, where you put it underneath a certain wavelengths of light and you look at it through, for lack of better terms, a microscope, and to find out if there's anything written on it. Now this is actually a discovery that was made in 2008, so we're still finding stuff currently. People say, well, all the good stuff was found years ago. But when it comes to handwriting in the ancient world, we are finding more and more of it because of the technology. And this is a case in point. This was very faint and hardly visible when they found this particular ostraca. As you can see, it is just a piece of what would have been a jar that had broken. And I often joke, they said, they never threw away pieces of big pieces of pottery because it became their place for writing memoranda. Pick up eggs at the store, the grocery list. And this is a case in point. This particular discovery was made in the Valley of Elah, and it dates to approximately the 10th century. There's some debate of whether it goes back as far as the 11th century, and that's why some date this to the period of Saul. Now, why is this important? It was because of the discovery, or where it was discovered, I should say. It was discovered in the Valley of Elah, overlooking where the famous battle between David and Goliath took place. And I had been at this particular site a number of times, and for a long time they couldn't figure out, when you read the biblical text, why they were at the Valley of Elah when they were fighting. Why did the battle take place at the Valley of Elah? It has only been in more recent years, in discoveries archaeologically and some of the texts that they found, that it appears to be the place where the border between the Philistine states and Israel was at that time. And this little, for lack of better terms, city, although it's more of a town, was an outpost overlooking that border. And they pretty much have determined this is probably where David met with Saul when he was discussing about going down and fighting the giant, because it was the border fortress. And it wasn't a huge city, so that's why they call it Kerbet. I can't remember whether I went over the language of Kerbet versus a Tel. When you think of something like I've dug at a Kerbet and I've dug at a Tel, Tel Shiloh is an ancient city that is built up in layers over a period of years, much like a cake, a layered cake. Whereas a Kerbet is usually a city or a town that is more one or two times used and is laid in ruins, or they would totally obliterate it and rebuild, and so there's no mound. You can walk over it and not even realize it's there many times. So when I dug at Kerbet el-Makadar, which is the place we think is Joshua's Eye, we didn't find a lot of inscriptions there, although we did find scarab evidence, which is like an inscription. But very common to, like I said, when you're digging there, to find things right on the surface. That's how low it is. You don't have to dig very deep. And this was the case in point. When they discovered this little town or outpost and they started excavating, this was the most important discovery they made. And it's written in a Paleo-Hebrew. And what is written here, and I have a, just show you a couple pictures of what the site looks like and the reconstruction of it, of the language. You can see it up there, the language and how it's, to us it looks like a bunch of scribbles, but it is actually a very detailed instruction list that is written in Paleo-Hebrew. And again, I've given you kind of the location of where it was found. It was found just inside the city gate. And I have stood inside that city gate where the arrow is. You can kind of see where it is. That's the main gate. We often think of gates somewhat differently than this, but that's the main entrance, the main threshold, and these were the chambers of the city gates. Very common for these to be 2 chambers, 4 chambers, and by 2 I'm going 2 here, 4 or 6 chambered gates. And just inside in the storehouses was where this particular artifact was found. And so when they translated it, this is what it said. Now obviously it's not a complete translation because it was a fragment that had been broken. You shall not do it, but worship the Lord, judge the slave and the widow, judge the orphan and the stranger, plead for the infant, plead for the poor and the widow, rehabilitate the poor at the hands of the king, protect the poor, and slaves support the stranger. What does that sound like? What book would we find something very similar to that? Take care of the poor, the widow, the orphan. It's the book of Deuteronomy. The last words of Moses were, when you entered the land, yeah, right, and you set a king over you, this is what they are to do. And so what they actually think is that this was an instruction list for Saul. That when Saul became the first king, there was a transition between the judges and the kings, that they had written this as kind of as a reminder of the things the king was to do. And it's interesting that here's Saul at the Valley of Elah, taking his first kind of kick at the can, so to speak, as the leadership. And he is following that transition from the judges to the kings. And this is what he is doing. So there, of course, when they translated this, it was quite a bit of buzz within the archaeological world. And of course, there's a debate on some of the words here on the translation, but it's pretty much set in stone, so to speak, now that this was a text that very clearly shows that transition period that's going on, which would put us back one of the earliest texts until, of course, the text that we just discussed last time when I was here, and that was the one from Mount Ebal.
So that was written on a broken piece of pottery?
Pottery, yep.
The inside part of
yep.
it, from the way it, so that was the tablet.
Yep.
Broken pottery was their tablet.
Yeah, so you could kind of see that. Now, obviously, this would not have been the official monument type writing, because we see this with both Moses and Joshua, when he says, when you enter the land, set up, pillars and inscribe the law on it. And of course, Joshua did this at Shechem as well. So we know that they were doing that. Normally, it would be more formal. So this seems to be more. I can almost see Samuel, sitting down and scribbling something. Just so you know, Saul, this is what you're to do. And scribbling this down.
How would they scratch it? How would they scribe on a piece of fired pottery? What was it? The writing tool, pencil of the day?
Probably more like a stylus, which it could be. I've actually, at Kermit El Makadar, we actually in my square, uncovered an ivory stylus. It was just, it looked, it was a piece of, almost looked like a straw, but it was solid, hard, but it was very fine, probably 1/8 of an inch, about the length of a worn down pencil, and with a sharpened point. And what they would do is ink wells. And they would just like, with, you know, the old feather.
So they wouldn't scratch it into the surface, they would write upon it.
This was written on it. So you could go back and you kind of look at what you were seeing there. They had drawn the lines for lined paper, and they had written on it in an ink. It must have been pretty good ink to survive, you know, you stop and consider. And that's why a lot of the stuff that when we are doing archaeological work, if we find a piece of pottery that's big, that's that big, we will run it through those scanners, through different light. So if anything is faded over time, it will pick it up, because the inks will fade. But this one was, you know, pretty much visible when they found it.
So that's possible that Samuel did write that.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can always speculate on what's going on here. Obviously it had to be someone literate. That was the major debate. And like I said, we talked, I think, briefly about that last class. Major debate within scholarship for years was that people weren't literate really until the 7th century, which would put it way over in the period of, you know, Hezekiah, Josiah, Manasseh, and that period. When in essence what they're finding now is earlier texts, just scribbled on pieces of pottery like this. So the average person must have been able to read and write, or at least a number of them would have been able to read and write, the educated class. Whereas before they thought, well, the Israelites were just a bunch of hicks. You know, they couldn't read and write. Matter of fact, when Joshua, I think it's Joshua who conquers, or was it, I'm trying to remember, the captured the young man, and he said, I want you to write down all the people who were, all the rulers of the city. They said, well, that's, you know, that never happened. Because after all, none of them could read and write, that's just made up. But now they're finding, well, no, they probably could read and write. But definitely the priestly class would have been able to read and write. So that's why I say Samuel's part of that class. And is it? Perhaps. I don't know. So.
Where is that piece now?
I'm not sure where they put it. I'm sure it's someplace in the Israel Antiquities. Whether it's in a museum, I'd have to check on that. I know for a long time when a discovery like this is made, now this has been close to coming up on, 18 years, it will usually make its round among scholars to do their analysis. But usually by the time that has run its course, it'll end up in a museum someplace.
Yeah. Good thing they didn't buy into that biodegradable stuff back then.
Yeah. Well, that's one thing about pottery, it's virtually indestructible. So, you know, that's why some of the things you find on it are pretty interesting. Now, here's another inscription that I found interesting when I first saw it. This is actually etched. This is not written as with ink. It was actually something sharp, pointed, etched into this particular piece of Philistine pottery. And it said, I guess I have, the inscription was scratched with a needle-like instrument on a small potsherd and dates from the 10th century to the mid-9th century BC. Of the two names on the, let me get this. The two names on the sherd, the first consists of 4 Semitic letters, TWLA, in Hebrew font, Aleph, Lamed, Vav, and Tav, which one particular scholar says may be the equivalent of the name Goliath, although it was written with Semitic letters. Now, we know that, and this was found at Tel El Safi, which is the ancient city of Gath. This is where Goliath lived. And so people read the text and they say, you know, that's just a good story, it never happened. We actually found Goliath's bowl. And this is, you know, it was a piece of, it was a part of a, would have been like I call it a porridge bowl. And etched on the side of it was his name. And this is why when you're doing a lot of this type of archaeological work, every little piece is scrutinized. Now, I took the time to show kind of how the language is working here. in early Semitic writing, by early Semitics, I'm just saying that Hebrew is part of the Semitic language group, and so you have things like Akkadian, Aramaic, Ugaritic, Arabic. A lot of these have similar origins, and so therefore they use a very common alphabet, even though they may have vocalized things differently. It's kind of like French, Italian, English. We all use the same alphabet, but some of the words cross over. This was the same type, and so here you actually got, I showed the letters, 1, 2, 3, and 4, what they look like written, and you say, well, how do you get Goliath out of that? That is because the first letter is actually guttural, which comes from the back of the throat, so that's where you get the sound. And then the W there is, we would say, the way we say Goliath today would have been vocalized more Goliath, from a very different vocalization. But that's the language, that's the way it is said today. It's kind of, or what way it would have been said then, it's kind of like when you say, is it Isaiah or is it Isaiah? Which is correct. It's actually Yeshayahu.
Yeah.
That's the Hebrew. But we don't say Yeshayahu. We say Isaiah. It's the way we vocalize things. And so it's the same thing with the ancient text. So this was ancient discovery that was made, dating again right to the period of Goliath. Here is a text that was found. This was found in Egypt, dated to approximately the 15th century. And what we actually have is the Proto-Canaanite alphabet with hieroglyphs beside it. This is coming from the work, if I recall, of Douglas Petrovich. I think I mentioned him last class, one of my guys that have worked with us over in Israel. He has long argued that the Hebrew alphabet was one of the earliest alphabets. As opposed to a Johnny-come-lately, it's one of the earlier ones. And here is a text that's showing the early alphabet beside the hieroglyphs showing the equivalence. It's kind of like the Rosetta Stone, how they cracked hieroglyphs. Here is what is known as the Gezer calendar, discovered in 1908. Again, just a piece of pottery with some etching on it, but very clearly written in an early language, early Proto-Hebrew. And it was found at Gezer. I've been at the place where this was found. Gezer is the city that was on the Judean plateau, kind of as it goes down towards the Sea of, the Mediterranean Sea, kind of halfway up the slope to Jerusalem. It was one of the fortifications that, if I recall, when Solomon married Pharaoh's daughter, you can read this in Kings, in chapter 3 of 1 Kings, one of the gifts that was given to Solomon for the wedding was Gezer. Pharaoh gave him the city, even though it was part of Israel at the time. Egypt had hegemony of the area, and Gezer was that city. Now, what did it actually say? This is what was etched on this little piece of pottery. 2 months of harvest, 2 months of planting, 2 months of late planting, a month of hoeing flax, a month of barley harvest, a month of harvest and feasting, 2 months of pruning, and a month of summer fruit. It's Ron's garden description. No, it was actually the layout of what a farmer was to do in that region, as far as in how their climate was laid out for growing.
So it's an almanac.
Yep, yeah. And so here's somebody who sat down and etched out. Now, was it for posterity, or was it for, son, I'm going away for a year? Make sure you do these things. Here's what you're to do.
Yeah, there's no hunting season in that.
Yeah, there's no hunting season. It was, that's the feasting.
That's every season.
Harvest and feasting included the hunting.
For about November, we need to put a gap in that.
Yeah. So, yeah, you can see that they had laid out the calendar of what was typical of that region. So, again, this is pushing, these types of things push against this whole concept that reading and writing came late. That this was something that was common if the average person is just writing down the calendar. They had to be able to read it, so.
That's odd that they would plant in December and January. It's really cold.
Yeah, well,
Late planting is what they said.
yeah, but here, look at the climate in the highlands of Israel is very similar to Tennessee. Does anybody plant stuff in the wintertime here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
we have winter things that we can plant. They would do the same thing. And where Gezer is, it's actually closer, it's heading down towards the Mediterranean. So they don't, while they get colder weather, they don't get it like in the highlands. When I say the highlands, I'm talking Jerusalem. Jerusalem and the highlands, they can get snow. Our archaeological team had for a number of years what was called our December dig. I never went on one because I always liked being home at Christmas. But they would dig over Christmas break. And one year they were digging in the highlands and they had 3 feet of snow. Like we just don't conceive of that in Israel. They were wading drifts up to their waist. But it would, within a day or so, it was gone.
Well, the Bible says that, confirms that, it says that David's men went down and killed a lion-like man in a pit on a snowy day.
Yeah. So they get their snow, but as you move off that highland, off that ridge, it gets warmer really quickly. So you can plant stuff in different areas. And Gezer is heading down. It's kind of like going down to the Dead Sea in the middle of the winter. In the Dead Sea, it's 80 degrees. And it's only 20 miles away, give or take.
I read a report by, I think it was put out by NOAA, the National Oceanager, that NOAA.
Yeah.
And they said that they determined where the most perfect weather in the world was, as far as humidity, mold, or Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem is the most perfect climate you can live in, most healthy. And I thought, no wonder God picked that to bring a new city down and say that.
Yeah. Well, the ancient maps had Jerusalem at the center of the world. Europe, Asia, and Africa. And you've probably seen the map. It looks like 3 petals. Asia, Africa, and in the middle of it is Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is the center of everything. So.
And David is the one that chose that to make it the capital?
Yeah, David actually, Jerusalem actually pre-exists David. It goes back to the book of Genesis with the city of Salem, where you have Melchizedek, who was the king and priest of Salem. Salem is just, Jerusalem is the city of peace, in Hebrew. And so...
There's been more war there than any other city.
Excuse me?
There's been more war there, though, than any other city.
Yeah, it's an ancient city. It goes way back to the, Bronze Age and beyond. So, matter of fact, Ezekiel mentions about Jerusalem that their father was the Hittite, your mother was a Amorite, or vice versa. So it goes back a long way. But he's the one that chose it. Yes. Probably one of the more interesting discoveries is what is known as the Tel Dan Stele. The date of it, 850 BC. The discovery happened in the early 90s. Why is this important? It's actually written in it's Semitic script, Canaanite, Israelite and Canaanite, very similar. But it is written by a foreign king. And Assyrian, not Assyrian, but a Syrian king from Syria. And it's talking about the defeat of the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel. And the discovery of it, you'll notice 1990, was right in the period when in Scandinavia, which is the northern part of Europe, they had there was a whole school of thought within the world of Old Testament studies and archaeology that when we read the book of Samuel and we learn about David, that is all, it was just a good story. It never happened. It was all mythology. And they published books and articles. They were called the Minimalist School, which means they believe very minimally in the Bible as far as it being historical. And they were saying that David, if he existed, was at best a petty chieftain. That when you read the biblical text and it says that his kingdom stretched from Damascus to the river of Egypt, that's just all made up. That's not real. That he probably had a little fiefdom or something there around Jerusalem, but that was probably the best that you could expect out of David's kingdom. That the Bible was pure mythology. And right at the height of all of this hoopla that they were making in the 80s, and it was gaining traction, and people were, talking about, how the Bible wasn't to be trusted, they found the Tel Dan Stele. And it was discovered by a lady working as a volunteer in Tel Dan, which is in the northern part of Israel. And she was, and I've done this many times, at the very end of the day, what you do is when they take the photos, they don't do it so much now because everything is done through drone shots and whatnot, but they would take square shots at the end of every day, and you would have to polish the stones in your square. By that I mean you take a broom, and the big stones that had a little bit of dirt on them, you would take and you broom them all off, and so the stone would pop in the picture. That's why all these archaeological pictures, the stones always look, they're so clear. It's because somebody has taken the time, and I've done it many times, and scrubbed the stones. And while she was scrubbing one of the stones, she noticed it had a little black tinge to it, which was unusual in Israel. The stones are either limestone white grayish is the color yellow. And so this stone kind of stood out. And then she polished it a little bit more, and she's like, wait a second, there's writing on this stone. And what she actually had found is the bigger part of these two stones. There's two pieces here. And so she called the dig director over, and of course, anytime you find writing in an archaeological dig, it's like everything comes to a complete standstill. And so he come over, and the place went abuzz, because what they had here was an inscription. And the next season, they started searching, they found the other piece, I think, of the next season, but they never found the rest of it. What it was a stele, or a monument, that had been erected sometime in the 9th century, around 850. And I have a question for you. How do you think they dated this? Radiocarbon dating?
No. Probably based on what, the
the
way it's written.
Writing. It's the writing. So they date it based upon other types that they have that they could date very clearly. And so it was the writing style. So it was very clearly from that 9th century, the 850s BC, and it matched perfectly with the text in the Bible. And matched the context perfectly of the text in the Bible and the Kings. But what they found is that this was a monument that had been made by a Syrian king when the battles were taking place between the northern kingdoms and the southern kingdoms and the Syrians. And the Syrians had they had defeated the king of Israel, the house of Israel and the house of David. Well, written there in that early script, and you can see, and I've noted this before, like with the way the language is written, you'll see little dots. Those dots are the divisions of words. And this is how they don't have vowels in them, so they would put the dot to show you where the division of the word. Well, this is a composite word, two words together, and it actually is written just consonantally, no vowels, and it says, Ba'ith David, the house of David. Now remember, when did David live?
When?
Oh, when did he leave?
Yeah, roughly when did he live? It's your test.
The 900s.
About 1000. So about 1010 to 970 is his dates. This is dated to 850. So this would be 150 years after the death of David.
So Solomon's children.
So if David was nothing but a petty chieftain, soon forgotten, why is a foreign king chiseling his name in stone, talking about his dynasty 120 years after his death? You can only imagine what that did to the Scandinavian school of thought.
Destroyed it.
It destroyed everything they had published for 20 years about David. They were saying that he was nothing. And so what do when they're faced with something like this? A clear text written in the language of that ancient time period. They said it was a forgery. It's got to be a forgery because it doesn't meet their scholarship. Then when they was proven it wasn't a forgery, that it was found in context of a wall in secondary use, clearly dating to an earlier period, then they said, well, it's written in the text is written very clearly in consonantal form. So therefore, because it's consonantal form, we could say it's the house of Dode, my beloved, because that's the same consonants, the house of my beloved, which would take away David. You see what they're trying to do. They don't want to admit that David, who was, as he's presented in the Bible.
Why would you defeat the house of your beloved, though?
It doesn't make sense. And so scholars, even the ones who were kind of had bought into a little bit of their minimalism, finally said, look, people, you need to let that go. It is clear that this is saying the house of David because the context is very clearly talking about what happens in 2 Kings 8 and 9. The battle between Syria and the house of David and the house of Omri. And in that time period, the two kingdoms had married together into Ahab's daughter had married one of the line of the house of David, and that they were fighting side by side against the Syrians, and they had been defeated. Now, and this here noted in the text of Kings. This would have been the period of Elisha, and Elisha talks about this.
How large is that piece?
Size-wise, I'm trying to remember. I think it was, don't quote me on that.
But that wasn't pottery, that was a solid piece of stone.
That was a stone.
And
And you'll notice it's actually basalt stone, it's black stone. This is why these types of things stand out in Israel, because they're not native to that region. You can get them in the Transjordan in the region of Syria, and so this was not a typical type of stone that you would find. I was walking around, I don't know whether I mentioned this last class, I was walking around the city walls of Jericho. And as I was walking around the city walls, I noticed a black stone sticking out of the dirt. I'm like, as an archaeologist, I said, well, that's not native. So I wonder what that is. So I climbed up on the side of the mound, pulled the stone out, and it was actually a basalt stone made into a grinder.
Made into
A grinder, like for grinding grain. Very clearly a man-made implement or tool. So these are the types of things, when you start doing archaeology, the things you get trained to see, and it's even the color of the stone. And so that's why something like this stands out. And it's not native. All right, moving along, we actually have what is known as the Siloam inscription. The Pool of Siloam is in Jerusalem. It was the pool that was made to receive the water from the Gihon spring. It also appears in the New Testament period. When Hezekiah was being threatened by not the Syrians, but the Assyrians, later in 2 Kings chapters 18 to 20, you can read the story about Sennacherib coming and attacking the land of Judah, how Hezekiah was trying to withstand that invasion of the Assyrians, and the famous line where Isaiah says that the king will never enter into the city of Jerusalem, that God would protect it. The Rabshakeh says, can your God protect your city? Where are the gods of Avaris, of Avayim, and all the different cities that I have conquered? And God said he will not enter into the city. That is the time period, about 701. We can date it very specifically to that time period because we have the Assyrian annals that also record the exact same events. What Hezekiah did from 704 to 701 is he prepared for the invasion, the inevitable invasion of the Assyrians. And one of the things he did is he dug the Hezekiah's tunnel. Did anybody ever walk through Hezekiah's tunnel? You've
Been
been in?
there, I didn't walk through.
Neither did I. I got claustrophobia. I don't go in there, but there is a tunnel. My wife has been through it. That was dug to bring the water from the Guyan Spring underground all the way in by natural flow, gravity flow, and this archaeological discovery was made by a little boy years later when they finally reopened the tunnel when they'd rediscovered it. Turn of the century, 1880. And this was under the Ottoman Turks. And what they did is they went in and they chiseled this thing off, and you can see they broke it. So this is a replica. I think the actual inscription is in Turkey, in Istanbul, if I recall. But it is the inscription that actually talks about how this was made, how the tunnel was made, where they started from each end and started digging towards the middle. How did they do that without the technology?
Yes.
They wondered whether they did it by sounding, whether they were tapping the rock above, because this is like 100 feet down. But they also were doing this, they were zigzagging, and they crossed paths. And this is the moment when they actually talked about the two meeting in the middle and the water flowing. So, dating to the 700s. Amulet inscription up until the discovery of, and I know I'm coming up on my time, up until the discovery of the Mount Ebal tablet. And this was, and the Khirbet Kaifa inscription, this is one of the earliest texts we had from the biblical text. Matter of fact, to this day, it is one of the earliest direct quotations from the Bible. It was found in a tomb outside of Jerusalem in 1979, and it actually is written on silver. It's a little amulet, and it would have been about the size of the last part of my pinky. There were two of them, and what they would do is they would wear them much like we would wear a good luck charm around their neck or on a bracelet or something. And they were found in the tomb, and obviously very corroded, but when they opened it up, they realized this had writing on it. And in the text, and I've given you a kind of blow up here of one of the words, that's actually the divine name, Yahweh, in ancient Hebrew. It actually contained a portion of number 624 to 26, which is, what?
The blessing.
The Aaronic blessing. And so it was verbatim of what we have in our biblical text. This dated to 600. Why is that important? Because scholarship for a long time had been saying that a lot of the Pentateuch was written during the exile while they were in Babylon. And this actually challenges that they had this text. It's like the Lord's Prayer for them. They had this text much, much earlier. So, and they were writing them down.
That's etched in silver.
Yeah, etched in silver. So, I don't know whether you want me to stop there. I'm pretty much, I've got a couple more slides, but I don't want to over.
Why don't you, let's go about 5 more minutes.
Okay. Quickly then, these are some of the more recent discoveries that have come out of the city of David. Some of the work in the city of David, which is in Jerusalem, they have discovered that David was not a petty chieftain. He actually had a very large administrative complex in Jerusalem, and they've been uncovering that over the past, well, the lady who was doing it has passed away, but it's still ongoing, the City of David Dig Project. Here's some of the things they've actually found. This is written obviously in early Hebrew, belonging to Hezekiah, the king of Judah. That's Hezekiah's seal. This is actually the impression would have been made with some type of a seal during his time period. Of course, Hezekiah is the transition between the 8th and 7th centuries. This is another seal they found in the city dated 2019. Actually has the seal of Nathan Melech. What they call comes out of the book of Jeremiah. So some of these names that were coming out of that time period, now they're finding the seals. One of the most important archaeological discoveries, of course, would be what are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm assuming you're familiar with the Dead Sea Scrolls. they are still finding fragments and/or what were the remnants. And again, how they dated this is the language. So they have scrolls that date from the 3rd century BC to the 1st century AD, and again, they date it based upon the paleography, the way the text was written. And so we have some of the earliest manuscripts of, for example, the book of Isaiah. We have the Great Isaiah Scroll. The earliest text that we have of the book of Daniel came out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which I find fascinating because scholars had said the book of Daniel is nothing but a 2nd century forgery written, and if you were in my Daniel class, I think we talked about this, that it was written in 164, right prior to the death of Antiochus Epiphanes, who died in 164. So therefore it had been written just about that time, because in chapter 11 they got his death place wrong. So therefore whoever was writing was trying to hurry and get it done, and so he got it wrong, not realizing this is talking about the death of the Antichrist, not Antiochus Epiphanes. But the earliest scroll that they found in the book of Daniel was 142 BC in the Dead Sea Scrolls. How is it possible that the book of Daniel, if it was written in 164, was written, copied, canonized in 20 years? But yet that's what the scholars say. But yet the Dead Sea Scrolls proved, I think, otherwise. One of the other archaeological discoveries that's very little known, but is interesting, is written in cuneiform. And this was the discovery of what is known as the Amarna letters, discovered in 1887 by a woman digging for fertilizer in Egypt at Tel Amarna. But what she found was a treasure trove of all the letters that was going between the region of Israel, or Canaan, and the region of Levant, between them and the kings of Egypt, of the very specific time period, only about 30 years, in the reigns of the Amenhoteps, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, right in that time period. And it's talking about the period of the Judges. This is 14th century of the 1300s. And it's interesting that some of the kings of this region are concerned with invaders coming in and taking over the land. And they call them the Apiru. And I know there's been a debate of whether that's a term for Hebrew, but all Apiru means is a landless foreign invader. That kind of describes the Israelites. And they're concerned, and they want the Egyptian pharaohs to send help. Because these Apiru are coming in and taking over the land of Canaan. And so there are those who argue that the Amarna letters are textual evidence that the Israelites were entering the land, not late, but early. So therefore it would make the date closer to the period of 1400s as opposed to 1200s. So that is, I think I went there.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Brian.
No problem.
Thank you so much.